my fellow wizards! In the last week, we've gotten teasers for all the new shadow spells that we'll be releasing along with Darkmoor in the next major update. For those that don't know, each original shadow spell is now getting a base, non-shadow version of the spell and a shadow-enhanced version that you use by fusing the new base spell with one of the new shadow creature spells. So, for example, if you want to use the new shadow version of Rusalka's Wrath, you would need to combine the new basic version of Rusalka with the Dark Shrike spell. Every shadow spell is also getting a shadow pact that requires varying hanging effects to be consumed every round, or you take damage instead. If you want more detail on how exactly that works, I recommend checking out my previous video on the topic that dives more deeply into how shadow pacts will work and the difference between shadow creatures and transformation spells. This video will assume you understand the basics of shadow pacts and focus on the new spell paths for both the new base spells and shadow enhanced spells. A couple other general things to keep in mind before we start is that all the new spells are getting a 5% accuracy bump, just like many other spells covered in recent teasers like the lore spells and PvP spells. In addition, you'll obviously need Spellements to upgrade both the basic and shadow enhanced paths for the spells. So how does that work? According to the devs, the Spellement used to upgrade the shadow enhanced version will be a separate Spellement, which is created using Spellements of the base version. So it looks like players will need to farm for the base Spellements and then craft the shadow version of the Spellement to upgrade your new shadow spells. We don't know yet where these Spellements will drop, so we'll have to wait and see. Okay, with the basics out of the way, we can start with Fire and the updated Dark Fiend spell. The new Dark Fiend deals 75 shadow damage and applies 3 75% damage over time traps on the target, with a shadow pact requiring traps on the caster. So before, Dark Fiend just did straight shadow damage after a few rounds, but now it sets up 3 faint damage over time traps, which is pretty cool and gives it much better utility. Then there's the new Shadow Transformation spell, Shadow Fiend, which applies a 25% outgoing damage and 25% outgoing Pierce aura on the caster, and gives the caster 1 Fire School pip with the Shadow Pact requiring traps on the target. This feels like a pretty solid offensive transformation with both a damage and Pierce boost, so I can definitely see this getting some use in PvE, and you can fairly easily set up the Shadow Pact by using something like Elemental or Spiritual Traps. Next up is Blast Off, where the base version of the spell for Path A now extends a damage over time by 1 round and applies a damage over time that deals 690 fire damage after 4 rounds to all enemies, and Path B applies 2 damage over times that each deal 385 split fire damage after 5 rounds and clears up to 5 shields from selected targets to apply 2 damage over time effects that each deal 250 fire damage over 3 rounds. I will note here that Path B is now very similar to Path B Elephant, also for 6 pips, so you can decide which one you want to use. Then the new Shadow Enhanced version for Path A extends a damage over time by 1 round and deals 1,700 fire damage after 4 rounds to all enemies, with the Shadow Pact requiring shields on the target. Then Path B applies 2 damage over time effects that each deal 280 split fire damage over 3 rounds, then applies 3 damage over time effects that each deal 435 split fire damage after 6 rounds to selected targets, with the Shadow Pact requiring shields on the target. Both the base and Shadow Path A have pretty massive bombs, which could be fun to detonate with something like Firecat Path B, or the new updated Krampus or Apocalypse paths, or the new Raging Bull we'll talk about in a minute. Then the Shadow Path B is interesting in that we're getting both regular damage over times and bombs on the same spell. This does feel like it's kind of working against itself when there's also these damage over times breaking shields, but the Shadow Pact requires shields be on the enemy. However, I will say if you can pull this off correctly, this does set you up to gambit those damage over times with something like Scion of Fire or Ifrit. After that, there's Fire from Above, where the base Tier 1 spell deals 415 fire damage and applies 3 30% fire traps on the target, while Tier 2 deals 450 fire damage and removes up to 2 heal over times from the caster to apply up to 2 65% fire traps on the target. So Tier 2 is now very similar to Heckhound, though I would argue Heckhound has the better utility. Then the Shadow Tier 1 spell deals 1,620 fire damage and applies 2 40% fire traps on the target, with the Shadow Pact requiring heal over times on the caster, while Tier 2 deals 890 fire damage and applies 5 75% fire traps on the target, with the Shadow Pact requiring heal over times on the caster. Tier 1 gets a huge bump in the initial damage from 995 up to 1,620 along with better traps, which is pretty awesome, while Tier 2 gets an insane 75% fire traps, so I think both have a lot of potential for PvE usage. In addition, there's Raging Bull, where the base Path A spell deals 430 fire damage to and applies negative 40% mantles on all enemies, while base Path B deals 520 split fire damage to selected enemies and detonates 2 damage over times for 130% of the remaining damage. Then the Shadow version, Path A, deals 975 fire damage and applies 3 damage over times that each deal 325 fire damage after 6 rounds to all enemies, with the Shadow Pact requiring damage over times on the target, while Path B deals 910 split fire damage and applies 3 damage over times that each deal 515 split fire damage after 6 rounds to selected targets, with the Shadow Pact requiring damage over times on the target. While the base versions of Raging Bull are pretty similar to the original version, the new Shadow Enhanced versions instead add a ton of bomb utility while also requiring damage over times on the target for their Shadow Packs, which is interesting. So it looks like you can either just upfront use the 3 bombs to pay for the cost of the Shadow Pact, or you have to quickly place some alternative damage over times for the Shadow Pact to consume instead. So this does make the spell feel like it's sort of working against itself if you actually want to use the bombs. Next up is Scorching Scimitars, where the base Path A spell deals 220 split fire damage to selected targets and restores 420 health to the caster over 3 rounds, while Path B clears up to 3 shields from selected targets to restore 195 health to the caster over 3 rounds, then deals 345 split fire damage to selected targets. So Path A is now very similar to Glacial Golem, so you can decide between higher fire damage or better heals. Meanwhile, the Shadow Path A spell deals 1,015 split fire damage to selected targets, with the Shadow Pact requiring shields on the target, and Path B deals 700 split fire damage to selected targets and restores 900 health to the caster over 4 rounds, with the Shadow Pact requiring shields on the target. So Shadow Path B loses the original trap utility and instead now applies a heal over time, which is interesting. Last is S'more Machine, where the base Path A spell deals 465 fire damage and applies 3 40% fire damage over time traps on the target, and Path B deals 475 fire damage and removes up to 2 heal over times from the caster to deal 490 fire damage over 5 rounds. Base Path A currently feels a bit like a more expensive Nap the Scarab, so I'm not sure if it will get as much use. Then the Shadow Path A spell deals 1,585 fire damage and applies 6 70% fire damage over time traps on the target, with the Shadow Pact requiring heal over times on the caster, while Path B deals 890 fire damage and applies 3 damage over time effects that each deal 540 fire damage over 6 rounds, with the Shadow Pact requiring heal over times on the caster. Shadow Path A here is pretty solid as a straight up damage dealer, and the addition of these 6 70% traps allows for some solid follow-up options if the thing you're trying to kill is somehow still alive. Then Shadow Path B removes the original heal over time utility to instead give you more damage over time effects, so you can also use this to potentially set up gambits with spells like Ifrit or Sign of Fire, or just detonate them for some extra damage. Moving on to Ice, there's the new Dark Sentinel that deals 75 shadow damage to the target and applies 3 negative 50% shields on the caster, with the Shadow Pact requiring charms on the target, so this is just a straight defensive option. Then there's the updated Shadow Sentinel that intercepts 50% of the incoming damage from allies and decreases incoming damage by 30% and gives the caster 1 Ice School pip, with the Shadow Pact requiring shields on the caster, so it's fairly similar to the original. Next up is Abominable Weaver, where the base version for Tier 1 deals 385 ice damage to the target and applies a negative 50% shield on the caster, while Tier 2 deals 375 ice damage to the target and removes up to 3 traps on the target to apply negative 75% shields of the target school on the caster. Obviously, for straight damage, you'd be better off using something like Ice Hound for 5 pips, but these do offer some extra defense if that's what you want. Then the Shadow Tier 1 spell deals 1,175 ice damage to the target and applies a negative 50% shield on the caster, with the Shadow Pact requiring traps on the target, while Tier 2 deals 730 ice damage to the target and applies 3 negative 80% shields of the target school on the caster, with the Shadow Pact requiring traps on the target. The Shadow Tier 1 version of Weaver is currently Ice's strongest single target shadow spell and gives you a shield, which is nice, so I'm glad the Shadow Pact should be fairly easy to set up with something like Elemental or Spiritual Trap. After that, we have Climaclysm, where the base Path A spell deals 200 split ice damage to and applies 60% ice traps on selected targets, while Path B deals 270 split ice damage to selected targets and removes up to 2 weaknesses to apply a 70% ice trap. Base Path A being very low split damage means you'd probably only use this in PvE if you want to set up the ice traps, so it's not as good a damage AoE compared to other options like Blizzard for the same amount of pips. Then the Shadow Path A deals 1010 split ice damage to selected targets, with the Shadow Pact requiring weaknesses on the target, while Path B deals 550 split ice damage to and applies 365% ice traps on selected targets, with the Shadow Pact requiring weaknesses on the target. Here, the Shadow Path B spell is moving away pretty drastically from the 70% chromatic shields to 365% traps, so they're definitely pushing toward making this a more offensive spell, which I think is a good choice. In addition, there's Freeze Ray, where the base Path A spell deals 415 ice damage to all enemies, and Path B clears up to 5 weaknesses from the caster to apply a negative 20% weakness to selected targets, then deals 425 split ice damage. So Path B here is now basically a cheaper Woolly Mammoth. Path A does fit nicely between Blizzard and Frost Giant damage-wise for 6 pips, so I definitely think this will get a lot of use in PvE. Then for the Shadow version, Path A deals 915 ice damage to all enemies, with the Shadow Pact requiring weaknesses on the caster, while Path B deals 755 split ice damage to and applies 2 negative 45% weaknesses on selected targets, with the Shadow Pact requiring weaknesses on the caster. Path A is definitely up there as one of Ice's stronger new AoEs, so I think it will get a lot of use. However, I do see setting up the Shadow Pact to be a little more difficult, so people may need to just eat the health cost instead if they want to use it often. Next up is Shatterhorn, where the base Path A spell deals 305 ice damage to the target and taunts the caster for 2 rounds, while Path B deals 325 ice damage to and removes up to 3 traps from the target to apply up to 3 negative 40% weaknesses on the target. Path A here loses a lot of damage because of the taunt utility, but I don't see that being used a lot in PvE, so the only case I see for using Shatterhorn is going down Path B because you want the weakness utility. Overall, it's just not useful for PvE unless you're trying to tank, which just isn't a common role in a group setting these days. Then for the Shadow version, Path A deals 1095 ice damage to the target and taunts the caster for 2 rounds, with the Shadow Pact requiring traps on the target, while Path B deals 655 ice damage to the target and applies 3 negative 45% weaknesses, with the Shadow Pact requiring traps on the target. It's pretty much the same deal here as I mentioned with the base version, where I just don't see this getting as much use in PvE since Shadow Abominable Tier 1 does more damage for the same amount of pips, and it gives you shield as well. Last is Snowball Barrage, where the base Path A spell deals 45 ice damage per pip to all enemies, and Path B clears up to 5 weaknesses from the caster to apply a negative 40% shield on the caster, then deals 430 split ice damage to selected targets. My main issue here is that Path A just does absolutely abysmal damage. If you have it unupgraded, it's actually weaker than Blizzard until you hit 7 pips, at which point you'd be far better off just using Frost Giant. So I think it needs a major buff, or it just won't be used as often, except maybe as a finisher if an enemy survives with just a bit of HP left. Meanwhile, the Shadow Path A deals 125 ice damage per pip to all enemies, with the Shadow Pact requiring weaknesses on the caster, while Path B deals 750 split ice damage to selected targets and applies 3 negative 60% shields on the caster, with the Shadow Pact requiring weaknesses on the caster. Obviously, compared to the base Path A, the Shadow Path A does amazing damage with 125 damage per pip unupgraded, so this will absolutely be used in PvE. Interestingly, Path B now applies negative 60% shields compared to the original 40% ice traps, so it almost feels like Snowball Barrage is swapping utility with Climaclysm. Third, we have Storm with the new Dark Strike spell that deals 75 shadow damage to the target and applies 3 20% blades on the caster, with the Shadow Pact requiring damage over times on the caster. Then there's the updated Shadow Shrike, which applies a 45% outgoing damage aura on the caster and gives the caster a Storm School pip, with the Shadow Pact requiring blades on the caster. Between the two, I think people will find far more use for Shadow Shrike in PvE than Dark Shrike, which just feels kind of meh in my opinion. Shadow Shrike itself is obviously losing its pierce to the new Myth Shadow transformation, so it's purely damage focused now. Next up is Dark and Stormy, where the base Path A spell deals 600 storm damage to the target and restores 450 health over 3 rounds to the caster, and Path B deals 715 storm damage to the target and removes up to 3 weaknesses from the target to restore 540 health to the caster over 5 rounds. So Path B here is now pretty similar to the new teased Berry Surprise. Then the Shadow version, Path A, deals 1,535 storm damage to the target and restores 1,350 health over 5 rounds to the caster, with the Shadow Pact requiring weaknesses on the target, while Path B deals 1,260 storm damage to the target and applies 2 heal over time effects on the caster that each restore 960 health over 5 rounds, with the Shadow Pact requiring weaknesses on the target. Just like the original, these Shadow spells offer some nice damage and healing, and the Shadow Pact should be fairly easy to set up with something like the newer Elemental or Spiritual weaknesses. After that is Glowbug Squall, where the base Tier 1 spell deals 520 storm damage to all enemies, and Tier 2 deals 510 split storm damage to selected targets and clears up to 2 damage over times from the caster to apply negative 20% weaknesses. Obviously, at max level, Bunyip's Rage is going to outclass Tier 1, but when you first get Glowbug Squall around level 100, this should be a very nice AoE to tide you over until you reach higher levels, so the use of this in PvE is mostly going to change depending on your level. Then for the new Shadow version, Tier 1 deals 1,145 storm damage to all enemies, with the Shadow Pact requiring damage over times on the caster, while Tier 2 deals 885 split storm damage to and applies 3 negative 30% weaknesses on selected targets, with the Shadow Pact requiring damage over times on the caster. Again, once you reach higher levels and get the new Sound of Musicology, Tier 1 will be outclassed, but at level 100 this will be a very nice AoE option for PvE players, although I think people need to be prepared to eat the health damage because the Shadow Pact will likely be difficult to fulfill. In addition, there's Iron Sultan, where the base Path A spell deals 495 split storm damage to selected targets, and Path B deals 350 split storm damage to selected targets and removes a heal over time on the caster to apply 2 45% weaknesses. Then for the Shadow version, Path A deals 1,450 split storm damage to and applies 2 negative 45% weaknesses on selected targets, with the Shadow Pact requiring heal over times on the caster, and Path B deals 865 split storm damage to and applies 4 negative 45% weaknesses on selected targets, with the Shadow Pact requiring heal over times on the caster. Just like the current versions of the spell, I don't see these really being used a lot in PvE because you just have so many other better AoE options that aren't split damage. Next is Rusalka's Wrath, where the base Path A spell deals 675 storm damage to the target and applies a random storm blade on the caster, either 15, 45, or 60%, while Path B deals 645 storm damage to and removes up to 3 weaknesses from the target to apply up to 3 55% blade of the caster school on the caster. I don't see Path A getting as much use in PvE because for 6 pips, if you want to deal damage, you could just use Triton. Then for the Shadow version, Path A deals 1,950 storm damage to the target and applies a random storm blade on the caster, either 15, 45, or 60%, with the Shadow Pact requiring weaknesses on the target, and Path B deals 1,200 storm damage to the target and applies 3 60% blades of the caster's school on the caster, with the Shadow Pact requiring weaknesses on the target. Obviously, Path A just does a massive amount of damage. This will definitely have a ton of value in PvE, and thankfully the Shadow Pact should be fairly easy to set up with the new Elemental or Spiritual weaknesses. Last is Sound of Musicology, where the base Path A spell deals 430 storm damage to all enemies and applies a 35% storm blade on the caster, and Path B deals 540 split storm damage to and removes up to 3 blades from selected targets to apply 50% storm blades on the caster. Just like with the new base Glowbug Squall, at max level, Bunyip's Rage is going to be your best 5-pip AoE option, but at lower levels, the new base Glowbug Squall actually does still outdamage Sound of Musicology, so you'd normally still want to use that over this until you hit max level. Meanwhile, for the Shadow version, Path A deals 1,285 storm damage to all enemies and applies a 45% Storm Blade on the caster with a Shadow Pact requiring charms on the caster, while Path B deals 975 split storm damage to selected targets and applies 3 65% Storm Blades on the caster with a Shadow Pact requiring charms on the caster. So the Shadow Path A is just a straight buff from the original, although the Pact requires charms on the caster, so the 45% blade might just be consumed to fulfill the Shadow Pact, so keep that in mind. This is also the case with the 3 65% blades from Shadow Path B, where unless you throw down an elemental or spiritual blade, the Shadow Pact will eat all the blades, so it does kind of work against itself in a way. Now we're shifting over to the spiritual school, starting with Life, which gets the Dark Seraph spell that deals 75 shadow damage to the target and restores 680 health to the caster over 4 rounds, with a Shadow Pact requiring traps on the caster. I'm not personally as crazy about this one since Life has so many solid healing options that don't require the risk of losing your health if you can't fulfill the Shadow Pact, so I think you'd only use this if you also want to clear traps from yourself, but in that case you'd be better off using something like Centaur Path B to remove traps without the risk of the Shadow Pact. Then there's the updated Shadow Seraph, which applies a 35% outgoing healing and 25% outgoing damage aura on the caster and gives the caster a Life School pip with the Shadow Pact requiring charms on the caster. This is interesting in that it allows you to kind of pivot between healing or damage dealing, although your damage output is slightly diminished because the Shadow Pact will eat your blades. Next up is Grenadier, where the base Path A deals 305 life damage to the target and pacifies the caster for 2 rounds, and Path B deals 350 life damage to the target and removes up to 3 blades from the caster to deal 225 life damage after 5 rounds. I honestly don't see anyone using base Path A, which does horrible damage for 5 pips and only offers the Pacify utility, which just isn't very good in PvE. Then for Path B, gambiting blades for bombs also just kind of feels like a bad trade to me. Then for the Shadow version, Path A deals 1,095 life damage to the target and pacifies the caster for 2 rounds, with the Shadow Pact requiring charms on the caster, while Path B deals 730 life damage to and applies 2 damage over time effects that each deal 390 life damage after 5 rounds on the target, with a Shadow Pact requiring charms on the caster. Path A here still has that Pacify utility that isn't very valuable, but it gets a buff to damage, and the pip cost has been reduced by 1 when you upgrade along the top path compared to the original, so that's still some positives. Then Shadow Path B is swapping the Activate Heal over time for another bomb utility, which we're seeing more and more life spells get. After that is Hungry Caterpillar, where the base tier 1 spell deals 270 life damage to the target and applies an 800 damage absorb on the caster, while tier 2 deals 340 life damage to the target and clears up to 4 traps on the caster to restore 250 health over 4 rounds. These don't feel like they'll be used a lot in PvE, since for tier 1 you're losing so much damage for the absorb, and for tier 2 you'd be better off using something like Leprechaun Path B for only 2 pips to accomplish something similar. Meanwhile, the Shadow tier 1 spell deals 875 life damage to the target and applies an 800 damage absorb on the caster, with a Shadow Pact requiring traps on the caster, while tier 2 deals 340 life damage to the target and applies 2 heal over time effects on the caster that each restore 565 health over 4 rounds, with a Shadow Pact requiring traps on the caster. So not a huge difference there, though the new Shadow Pact will eat into your healing if you can't fulfill the Shadow Pact, which is kind of annoying. In addition, there's Lamassu, where the base Path A spell deals 330 split life damage to selected targets, and Path B deals 280 split life damage to selected targets and clears up to 3 traps to apply 35% life blades on the caster. I think it's unlikely these will get much use in PvE with such low damage compared to other AoE options like Rat Spin, and again you can use Centaur for a better option for clearing traps to get blades. Then for the Shadow version, Path A deals 830 split life damage to selected targets, with the Shadow Pact requiring traps on the caster, and Path B deals 550 split life damage to selected targets and applies 2 55% life blades on the caster, with the Shadow Pact requiring traps on the caster. Just like previous life shadow spells, I do see people struggling to fulfill the Shadow Pact here unless the enemy is trap stacking you, so just keep that in mind. Next is Lord of the Jungle, where the base Path A spell deals 360 life damage to all enemies, then removes an absorb from the caster to apply a life blade whose percentage is equal to 10% of the absorb's remaining damage, while Path B deals 420 split life damage to selected targets and removes up to 2 damage over time effects to apply a 60% life blade and healing charm. I don't see Path A being used as much in PvE when there are better AoEs available, and the absorb to blade conversion just feels like it will almost never be used. Then Path B is basically a more expensive Nature's Wrath. For the Shadow version, Path A deals 990 life damage to all enemies and applies 2 65% blades on the caster, with a Shadow Pact requiring damage over times on the target. And Path B deals 740 split life damage to selected targets and applies 3 55% life blades and healing charms on the caster, with a Shadow Pact requiring damage over times on the target. I will say that Path A does feel much improved from the original, with it now just straight up giving you 2 65% blades, so I think this will see more use in PvE now as an AoE option. Last is Wings of Fate, where the base Path A spell deals 75 life damage, then deals 270 life damage over 3 rounds to all enemies, and restores 75 health, then restores 275 health over 3 rounds to all allies, while Path B applies 2 damage over time effects that each deal 320 split life damage after 5 rounds to selected targets, and removes up to 3 blades from the caster to restore 530 health over 5 rounds. Then for the Shadow versions, Path A deals 75 life damage, then deals 825 life damage over 3 rounds to all enemies, and restores 75 health, then restores 825 health over 3 rounds to all allies, with a Shadow Pact requiring charms on the caster. And Path B applies 3 damage over time effects that each deal 365 split life damage after 6 rounds to selected targets, and applies 2 heal over time effects that each restore 960 health over 5 rounds, with a Shadow Pact requiring charms on the caster. I think life has better healing and damage over time options and other spells without needing to fulfill a Shadow Pact, so I'm not sure how much use either version of the spell will get in PvE. Shifting over to Myth, we can start with the updated Dark Nova, which now deals 75 shadow damage and applies 3 30% traps on the target, with the Shadow Pact requiring weaknesses on the caster. This feels like it works against itself a bit because the initial shadow hit will likely remove a weakness that you then need to fulfill the Shadow Pact, so I'm not sure how popular it will be. Then there's the new Shadow Nova, which applies a 50% outgoing Pierce aura and gives the caster 1 Myth School pip, with the Shadow Pact requiring traps on the enemy. So this is basically replacing the old Shadow Shrike for having the most amount of Pierce for a Shadow transformation. Next up is Barbarian Saga, where the base Path A spell deals 425 myth damage, then deals 220 myth damage after 3 rounds to the target, and Path B deals 440 myth damage to the target and removes up to 3 shields to deal 250 myth damage after 5 rounds. Path A I just don't see being used in PvE over something like Stone Colossus for the same amount of pips when you have to wait for the bombs to go off, and then Path B is also very similar to Orthrus for 1 less pip. Meanwhile, for the Shadow version, Path A deals 1,225 myth damage, then deals 230 myth damage after 3 rounds to the target, with the Shadow Pact requiring shields on the caster, and Path B deals 900 myth damage, then applies 2 damage over time effects that each deal 385 myth damage after 5 rounds to the target, with the Shadow Pact requiring shields on the caster. I will say the Shadow versions definitely have one of the easier Shadow Pacts to set up, requiring only 3 shields, so you can just use Elemental or Spiritual Shield. After that is Mystic Colossus, where the base Tier 1 spell removes 1 shield and deals 290 myth damage to all enemies, and Tier 2 steals 4 shields, then deals 390 split myth damage to selected targets. Path A is only useful if the enemies have strong shields, otherwise you're better off using other AoEs like Humongo Frog for less pips, but Path B counters shields a bit better at least. Then for the Shadow version, Tier 1 removes 1 shield, then deals 790 myth damage to all enemies, with a Shadow Pact requiring shields on the enemy, while Tier 2 deals 735 split myth damage to selected targets, then applies 3 -55% shields on the caster, with a Shadow Pact requiring shields on the enemy. For Path A, the damage is decent, however it feels like it's working against itself because it removes a shield, then deals damage, which may also remove shields, then requires shields on the enemy for the Shadow Pact, so I feel like that might need a rework. In addition, there's Snake Charmer, where the base Path A spell deals 45 split myth damage, then deals 390 split myth damage over 3 rounds to selected targets, while Path B clears up to 3 weaknesses from the caster to deal 225 split myth damage over 3 rounds, then deals 305 split myth damage to selected targets. Path A looks like a decent low-cost shield killer if several enemies are spamming shields, and Path B also clears weaknesses first, so I'd argue it's an even better option to remove both weaknesses and shields at the same time. This is a bit similar to Stone Colossus, but cheaper to use. Then for the Shadow version, Path A deals 895 split myth damage to selected targets with a Shadow Pact requiring weaknesses on the caster, and Path B deals 630 split myth damage, then deals 350 split myth damage over 3 rounds to selected targets with a Shadow Pact requiring weaknesses on the caster. My issue here is that both Path A and B will likely remove weaknesses when hitting, then require weaknesses as part of the pact, so this is only good when you're just absolutely bogged down in weaknesses. Next is Tatzelworm Terror, where the base Path A spell deals 325 myth damage and applies a 50% chance to confuse all enemies for 1 round, and Path B deals 385 split myth damage and removes up to 3 traps to apply 50% traps to selected targets. Path A could be kind of fun to mess around with for the confuse utility, but I don't see Path B having as many situations where it'd be useful since you're removing traps to then apply traps. Then for the Shadow versions, Path A deals 975 myth damage and applies a 50% chance to confuse all enemies for 1 round, with the Shadow Pact requiring traps on the target, while Path B deals 680 split myth damage, then applies 3 60% traps on selected targets, with the Shadow Pact requiring traps on the target. Path B is odd in that the traps it applies will be immediately used up to fulfill the Shadow Pact, so you wouldn't get to use them unless you placed yet more traps down to be eaten for the Shadow Pact, so this is another one that might need some reworking. Last is Witch's House Call, where the base Path A spell deals 560 myth damage to the target and summons a myth minion, and Path B deals 485 myth damage to the target and removes up to 2 damage over times on the target to apply 2 60% traps per damage over time removed. For Path A, unless you really want the myth minion, you're better off just using Stone Colossus for 6 pips for damage instead. Then Path B is pretty similar to Cyclops, so that is an alternative if you want a similar utility. Then for the Shadow versions, Path A deals 1,520 myth damage to the target, summons a myth minion, and applies 2 70% traps on the target, with a Shadow Pact requiring damage over times on the target, while Path B deals 865 myth damage to the target and applies 5 70% traps on the target, with a Shadow Pact requiring damage over times on the target. Path A does an insane amount of damage, going all the way up to 1,560 damage when fully upgraded, while also applying those 70% traps. So if anything is still alive after the initial hit, you're already set up for a buffed follow-up hit. Then Path B does do less damage, but you get 5 70% traps, which is also crazy. Last for our Spirit Schools is Death, which gets an updated Dark Shepherd spell, which deals 75 shadow damage and applies 3 -20% weaknesses on the target, with a Shadow Pact requiring heal over times on the target. There's nothing too crazy here, so I don't see this getting much use in PvE. Then there's the new Shadow Shepherd, which applies a 55% outgoing drain damage aura on the caster and gives the caster a Death School pip, with a Shadow Pact requiring weaknesses on the target. This is a pretty massive boost to drain spells, and it's fairly easy to set up the Shadow Pact with something like Elemental or Spiritual Weakness, so I could definitely see this being used to set up a massive drain hit. Next up is Call of Krulu, where the base tier 1 spell deals 315 drain damage to all enemies, and tier 2 deals 320 split drain damage to, and clears up to 2 heal over times from selected targets to apply a -30% chromatic weakness. So Path A is slightly better than base Ship of Fools for 1 more pip, but if you have a fully upgraded Ship of Fools Path A, that's always going to be a better option, so keep that in mind. Then for the Shadow versions, tier 1 deals 690 drain damage to all enemies, with the Shadow Pact requiring heal over times on the target, and tier 2 deals 605 split drain damage to and applies 2 -40% chromatic weaknesses on selected targets, with the Shadow Pact requiring heal over times on the target. Unfortunately, Path A is only 15 damage better than the original, and you'll be taking a good chunk of damage if you can't fulfill the Shadow Pact, so this may actually end up being kind of a nerf in some ways. Then Path B loses the negative aura to instead apply chromatic weaknesses compared to the original. After that is Grim Reader, where the base Path A deals 405 death damage to and applies 2 -25% weaknesses on the target, and Path B deals 440 death damage to the target and removes up to 3 shields from the caster to apply a -45% chromatic weakness on the target, so Path B is basically a higher ranked Dark Sprite. Then for the Shadow versions, Path A deals 1,160 death damage to and applies 2 -25% weaknesses on the target, with a Shadow Pact requiring shields on the caster, and Path B deals 860 death damage to and applies 3 -45% chromatic weaknesses on the target, with the Shadow Pact requiring shields on the caster. Thankfully, the shadow packs here are very easy to set up with either elemental or spiritual shields, so that's nice at least, and this is one of Death's strongest shadow hits. In addition, there's Kisma's Curse, where the base path A deals 340 split death damage to selected targets, and path B deals 260 split death damage to selected targets, and removes up to 2 charms from the caster to apply a negative 70% shield on the caster. Then for the shadow versions, path A deals 875 split death damage to selected targets, then applies a negative 75% shield on the caster, with the shadow pact requiring charms on the caster, and path B deals 550 split death damage to selected targets, then applies 3 negative 70% shields on the caster, with the shadow pact requiring charms on the caster. The base path A is easily outdamaged by other death AoE, so I don't see it being used much in PvE, and the shadow paths are only useful if you want the shields. Next is Snack Attack, where the base path A spell pushes 1 weakness off the caster, then deals 475 death damage to all enemies, while path B deals 495 split death damage to selected targets, then removes up to 3 shields from the caster to apply 55% death blades on the caster. Path A is a decent option if you have a weakness you need to remove before hitting, and it does have better damage for 1 more pip than a fully upgraded Ship of Fools Path B, so that's a solid alternative. Then for the shadow versions, path A pushes 1 weakness off the caster, then deals 890 death damage to all enemies, with the shadow pact requiring shields on the caster, and path B deals 685 split death damage to selected targets, then applies 3 50% death blades on the caster, with the shadow pact requiring shields on the caster. Path A is actually a pretty strong AoE and also removes a weakness in the process, which is nice, and the shadow pact is easy to set up with an elemental or spiritual shield, so I can definitely see it being used in PvE. Last is Winged Sorrow, where the base path A spell deals 405 death damage to the target and applies negative 20% weaknesses on all enemies, and path B deals 405 death damage to the target and clears up to 5 blades from the target to apply negative 25% weaknesses. Obviously, other spells outdamage Winged Sorrow at 6 pips, so this is only useful if you want the extra weaknesses. Then for the shadow versions, path A deals 1075 death damage to the target, then applies negative 20% weaknesses on all enemies, with the shadow pact requiring charms on the target, and path B deals 835 death damage to, then applies 2 negative 45% weaknesses on the target, with the shadow pact requiring charms on the target. One of the biggest changes here is Shadow Path B losing the negative healing aura for weaknesses instead, but otherwise Path A does get outclassed by Grim Reader for the same amount of pips and a similar utility. Finally, we have Balance, which gets the new Dark Trickster spell, which I think wins for the most hieroglyphic, hardest to read card we've gotten from these teasers. But to translate, it deals 75 shadow damage, then applies a 35% Pierce Blade of the caster's school on the caster, and 2 35% traps of the caster's Weaving School on the target, with the shadow pack requiring shields on the caster. So basically this helps if you're trying to dual school, I guess. Then there's the updated Shadow Trickster, which now applies a 25% outgoing damage aura on the caster, steals a pip from the target, and gives the caster 1 Balance School pip with a Shadow Pact requiring shields on the caster. I think you're mostly better off picking the new Shadow Shrike over this for 45% outgoing damage for PvE, so I'm not sure how much use this will get. Up next is Gaze of Fate, where the base tier 1 deals 120 balance damage to the target, then applies a 25% balance damage bubble, and Path B deals 180 balance damage and damage of the target school to the target, then removes up to 3 traps from the target to apply 45% blades on the caster. Then for the Shadow versions, Tier 1 deals 520 balance damage and damage of a random school to the target, then applies a 25% balance damage bubble, with the Shadow Pact requiring traps on the target, while Tier 2 deals 370 balance damage and damage of the target school to the target, then applies 3 50% blades on the caster, with the Shadow Pact requiring traps on the target. I don't see either of these versions having much use in PvE, although I will say I don't think Balance has many other options for gambiting shields for blades, so the new base Path B at least gives you that utility if you want it. After that is Mockenspiel, where the base Path A spell deals 390 balance damage to the target and converts up to 3 blades on the caster into universal blades, and Path B deals 320 balance damage to the target and removes up to 2 damage over times on the target to apply 2 negative 40% weaknesses. Then for the Shadow versions, Path A deals 1,145 balance damage to the target and converts up to 9 blades on the caster into universal blades, with the Shadow Pact requiring damage over times on the target. And Path B deals 675 balance damage to and applies 5 -45% weaknesses on the target, with the Shadow Pact requiring damage over times on the target. The blade conversion into universal blades is pretty interesting here and could help balance wizards stack up higher blades than they normally could with their standard blades, depending on how this works. Then the Shadow Path A does have one of Balance's strongest single target hits, which is nice, though the damage over times on the enemy for the Shadow Pact may be hard to pull off. In addition, there's Nested Fury, where the base Path A spell deals 410 ice damage, 495 fire damage, or 620 storm damage to all enemies, and Path B deals 375 split balance damage to selected targets and removes up to 2 heal over times for 2 -70% shields. I will say that Path A offers a nice AoE option between Sandstorm and Power Nova in damage, so I do think that will be useful to a lot of players. Then for the Shadow versions, Path A deals 1,080 storm, fire, or ice damage to all enemies and applies 2 -75% shields on the caster, with the Shadow Pact requiring heal over times on the caster. And Path B deals 730 split balance damage to selected targets and applies 5 -75% shields on the caster, with the Shadow Pact requiring heal over times on the caster. Here, Path A and B also offer some really nice -75% shields, so especially for Path A, you get a pretty heavy hit followed by upping your own defenses. The main issue I see is the heal over time spamming you'll need to do to fulfill the Shadow Pact. Next is Old One's Endgame, where the base Path A spell deals 380 balance damage to all enemies and converts the next balance damage hit to a random school, and Path B deals 355 split balance damage to selected targets and removes up to 3 shields from the caster to restore 530 health over 5 rounds. Then for the Shadow versions, Path A deals 955 balance damage to all enemies and converts the next balance damage hit to a random school, with the Shadow Pact requiring shields on the caster, and Path B deals 765 split balance damage to selected targets and applies 2 heal over time effects on the caster that each restore 760 health over 4 rounds, with the Shadow Pact requiring shields on the caster. I don't see either Path A getting as much use in PvE when you can use the new Nested Fury Path A for better damage for the same amount of pips, and Weaving also offers ways to convert balance damage into other school damage quite easily. Then both Path Bs are moving away from the original bomb utility to instead offer healing, which is interesting. Last is Sandworm, where the base Path A spell deals 250 split balance damage to and applies 35% traps on selected targets, while Path B deals 275 split balance damage to selected targets and removes up to 2 charms from the caster to apply 55% damage traps. Then for the Shadow versions, Path A deals 875 split balance damage to and applies a 55% trap on selected targets, with the Shadow Pact requiring charms on the caster, and Path B deals 565 split balance damage to and applies 3 55% traps on selected targets, with the Shadow Pact requiring charms on the caster. I don't see many of the options here being used much for PvE unless you're trying to set up a lot of traps for a follow-up hit, because you have far better alternative AoE options for shadow spells and regular spells that aren't split damage. So with all those spells covered, there's definitely a lot to think about. While it's awesome to see so many shadow spells receiving huge buffs in damage, not every Shadow Pact is easy to fulfill, so people need to be prepared to eat the 15% health cost if they can't offer up the correct hanging effects for 3 rounds. It's also possible that the huge damage buffs will actually become a sort of double-edged sword, because I think quite often people will be using them to finish the fight, which means they'll automatically take the 15% health loss from the Shadow Pact because there won't be any rounds left to trade over the hanging effects because the fight will be over. So if I could change one aspect of the new system, I definitely want to add a mechanic where if you end a fight with a shadow spell and have the required hanging effects, it just takes all of them in one go to pay for the spell rather than punishing you for ending the fight early. There's also the issue here of some new shadow spells sort of working against themselves with regards to the type of Shadow Pact they have. Some examples include Raging Bull, Tatzelworm Terror, Mystic Colossus, and Sound of Musicology, where the utility the spells offer basically get immediately used up to fulfill the Shadow Pact unless you immediately place another hanging effect, which feels like poor design. I will say I was pleasantly surprised by some of the new additions to the base version of the spells, with schools like Ice, Balance, and Death getting some solid middle-of-the-road AoEs to use in addition to their 4 and 7 pip options. However, there's still a lot of spells in here, both Shadow and Base, that I just don't see PvP or PvE players using, so those may need another look by the developers. Overall, I think whether you like or hate the new Shadow spells is going to depend on how willing you are as a player to work around the Shadow packs, so I think these changes are going to have mixed opinions no matter what. I definitely fall somewhere in the middle where I really like some changes and kind of hate others, so I hope we can work with the devs to improve the ones that fall short at the moment. But definitely let me know in the comments below what you think of all these changes and what spells you like the most or the least. Alright my fellow wizards, that was my video covering every single new shadow spell in the next update. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing, as it really does help me to make more amazing Wiz content for you all. And if you want to support me and the channel further, you can hit the join button below to become one of my awesome channel members. As always, I hope to see you out there in the spiral, and happy questing!